The cemetery was older than memory, a tangled expanse of cracked headstones, gnarled trees, and a suffocating fog that never lifted even under the midday sun. Locals whispered of a curse, but no one dared to speak of the Watcher, the unseen force that guarded the graves. The few who entered after dark rarely came back, and those who did returned changed, haunted by shadows that lingered just beyond the light. Riley didn't believe in curses. A journalist hungry for a breakthrough story, she dismissed the warnings of the locals as mere superstition. Armed with a flashlight, a notepad, and a recorder, she stepped through the rusted gates of Blackwood Cemetery. The creak of metal echoed into the oppressive stillness, making her pause. She shook it off, determined to prove her courage. The cemetery sprawled like a forgotten city. Moss-covered statues loomed over graves, their faces weathered into grotesque expressions. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of her boots on the gravel path. She wandered deeper, her flashlight carving through the fog, revealing glimpses of angel wings, skeletal trees, and names long lost to time. Then came the sound, a faint, raspy whisper. Riley froze. The beam of her flashlight trembled as she scanned the darkness. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice unnaturally loud against the quiet. The whisper grew louder, threading itself into her ears like a poisonous vine. It wasn't words, just a low, inhuman murmur that seemed to crawl beneath her skin. Ignoring the chill creeping up her spine, Riley pressed on. She reached a mausoleum, its iron door ajar. The inside beckoned with an unnatural darkness. She hesitated before stepping inside, her flashlight revealing the crumbling stone walls and an empty coffin at the center. Scribbled on the walls in a language she couldn't decipher were symbols that seemed to writhe when she looked at them too long. Her recorder crackled to life. A voice, not her own, spoke through it. "You shouldn't be here." She dropped the device. The sound of plastic hitting stone echoing through the mausoleum. The temperature plummeted, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. Then she saw it, just a glimpse. A figure in the corner of her eye. Pale, elongated, and moving with a jerking motion, as though it didn't quite belong to this world. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figure grew closer, its hollow eyes dripping shadows. When it opened its mouth, the whispering exploded into a deafening cacophony, each sound clawing at her sanity. Riley stumbled back, tripping over the threshold of the mausoleum. The moment she hit the ground outside, the whispers stopped. The air was still, but something was wrong. Her flashlight flickered, then died. She fumbled for her phone, but its screen was a fractured void. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Not hers. Slow, deliberate, crunching the gravel behind her. She bolted, heart pounding in her ears. The cemetery seemed endless, paths twisting in impossible directions. The headstones blurred into a maze of jagged stone, and the fog thickened, swallowing the world around her. She could feel it chasing her, the Watcher, its presence heavy and suffocating. Riley tripped again, sprawling against a gravestone. Turning over, she saw it standing above her, impossibly tall and shrouded in darkness. Its face, or what passed for one, was a void, yet she felt its gaze burrowing into her soul. "No one leaves," it whispered, the words reverberating inside her skull. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. The Watcher raised a hand, skeletal and dripping with black ichor path, and everything went dark. When Riley awoke, she was back at the cemetery gates, her recorder and flashlight lying beside her. She stumbled to her feet, trembling, and fled to her car. The locals found her the next day, sitting in her car at the edge of town, muttering to herself. She wouldn't say what happened, only that she was never going back. But she wasn't alone. Every night, as Riley tried to sleep, she'd hear it. The faint whisper growing louder. The Watcher had followed her, and now there was nowhere she could run. It began on a moonless night, the kind where the darkness feels alive, wrapping itself around everything like a suffocating shroud. The cemetery was quiet, as expected, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the cold wind. Yet, beneath the silence, there was a hum, a low vibration, imperceptible at first, but impossible to ignore once noticed. Emma didn't want to be there. Her friends had dared her, knowing she hated the stories about Hollow Pine Cemetery. It wasn't just the tales of ghostly apparitions or phantom whispers that unnerved her. It was the legend of the gravedigger. The story went that decades ago, a gravedigger had been buried alive after being mistaken for dead. They said his spirit never left, wandering the grounds at night, searching for vengeance or a way to escape his eternal prison. People claimed to hear the scrape of his shovel against the earth, even on nights when the wind was still. Emma laughed it off, pretending bravery she didn't feel. Now standing inside the gates, her flashlight barely cutting through the inky blackness, she regretted her bravado. The cemetery stretched endlessly before her, the tombstones like jagged teeth in the ground. A dare was a dare, though, and all she had to do was find the statue of the angel in the cemetery's heart and snap a picture. Her friends would never let her live it down if she chickened out. The gravel path crunched under her boots as she walked deeper into the graveyard. The air was colder here, biting at her skin, and her flashlight flickered despite fresh batteries. She paused, glancing around. The silence pressed in, heavy and unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. That's when she heard it, the unmistakable scrape of metal on stone. Emma froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound came again, closer this time. She swung her flashlight wildly, but the beam revealed only headstones and shadows. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No answer. Only the scraping sound, steady and deliberate, as if something was being unearthed. She moved faster now, her feet crunching against the gravel as she tried to stay on the path. The angel statue wasn't far. She'd studied a map of the cemetery earlier. The sound followed her, always just behind. When she reached the clearing, the angel loomed before her. Its marble face was cracked, its wings chipped, but it was unmistakable. Relief flooded her as she raised her phone to take a picture. A shadow moved behind the statue. Emma froze, her finger hovering over the camera button. The shadow wasn't natural. It didn't shift with her flashlight. Instead, it moved independently, slinking along the ground toward her. Then she saw him. The figure emerged from behind the angel, his form hunched and shrouded in tattered clothes. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but the glint of his eyes caught the light, a sickly, unnatural glow. In his hand was a rusted shovel, its blade caked with something dark. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure rasped, his voice low and guttural. Emma turned and ran, her heart pounding in her ears. The scraping sound was louder now, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps that matched her own pace. She didn't dare look back, too afraid of what she might see. The path twisted and turned, the graves blurring into a chaotic sea of shadows. Emma stumbled, falling to her knees. Her flashlight skidded away, its beam flickering out. She scrambled to her feet, but the footsteps were upon her. A hand clamped down on her shoulder, cold and impossibly strong. She screamed, turning to face her pursuer. The gravedigger's face was a nightmare, his flesh gray and decayed, his mouth twisted into a grin that revealed jagged, blackened teeth. His eyes were empty voids, but she felt them boring into her soul. "You're staying," he growled. The shovel rose, its blade catching the faint moonlight that had somehow broken through the darkness. Emma's screams echoed through the cemetery, but no one was there to hear them. Days later, her friends returned, laughing about her supposed cowardice. They found her phone lying at the base of the angel statue, the screen cracked but still functioning. The last photo she had taken was of the angel. Standing beside it was the gravedigger, his hollow eyes staring directly into the lens, a crooked smile on his rotting face. Behind him, half buried in the earth, was an open grave. The bus came to a stop at the edge of Ravenshore, a forgotten town surrounded by dense woods and whispers of the dead. Mia had been traveling alone, trying to escape the monotony of her life, but this wasn't her intended destination. The driver had mumbled something about engine trouble and an overnight delay. "Only one inn," he had said, pointing her toward a narrow road lined with looming trees. The inn sat on the edge of a sprawling cemetery, its iron gates partially open as if beckoning visitors. The building itself was ancient, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of years. The innkeeper, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, handed Mia a tarnished key without a word. Her room was small, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. A single window faced the cemetery, its view obscured by mist. Exhausted, Mia dropped her bag and collapsed onto the creaking bed. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. She awoke to the sound of something tapping on the window. Her heart raced as she sat up, staring at the glass. The fog outside was impenetrable, but the tapping persisted, rhythmic and deliberate. Gathering her courage, she approached the window and peered into the darkness. Nothing. She closed the curtain, trying to convince herself it was just a branch or the wind. But as she turned back toward the bed, she froze. A figure stood in the corner of her room, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its face was obscured by shadow, but she could feel its gaze fixed on her. Mia stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. Who are you?" she whispered. The figure didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, long fingers pointing toward the window. The tapping resumed, louder now, more insistent. Terrified, Mia grabbed her bag and bolted from the room, racing down the narrow hallway. The inn was eerily silent, the walls seeming to close in around her. She reached the front door and yanked it open, only to be met with an icy wind and the endless fog of the cemetery. She hesitated, but the sound of footsteps behind her forced her forward. The cemetery's gates creaked as she pushed through them, the cold seeping into her bones. Gravestones jutted from the earth like broken teeth, their inscriptions worn away by time. The fog seemed alive, curling around her ankles and muffling her every step. Then she saw it, a fresh grave in the center of the cemetery, its edges jagged and raw. A single lantern flickered nearby, casting an eerie glow over the scene. As she approached, she realized the grave wasn't empty. A coffin lay within, its lid slightly ajar. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but something compelled her forward. Inside the coffin lay herself. Mia stared in horror at the lifeless version of her, pale and unmoving. The figure from her room appeared at the edge of the grave, its twisted form even more grotesque in the flickering light. "You don't belong here," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping together. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure reached into the grave, its fingers wrapping around the edge of the coffin lid. Slowly, it began to close it. "No!" Mia screamed, finally finding her voice. She turned to run, but the fog thickened, blinding her. She stumbled and fell, the world spinning around her. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her room at the inn, the morning light streaming through the window. She gasped, sitting up and clutching her chest. It had to have been a nightmare. But as she reached for her bag, her hand brushed against something cold and damp. She looked down to see a clump of soil clinging to her fingers, and the faint scent of earth filled the room. Outside the window, the cemetery lay shrouded in mist, and in the center, where the fresh grave had been, stood the figure, watching her. The wind howled through the small, forgotten village of Ashwood, where the air always seemed heavy, and the nights stretched on far longer than they should. At the edge of town stood St. Mercy Cemetery, an ancient burial ground surrounded by a rusted wrought iron fence. It was a place no one dared to visit after dark, not since the disappearance of Clara Benson 5 years ago. Despite the warnings, David, a skeptic and self-proclaimed ghost debunker, decided to investigate the cemetery. He was a firm believer that all the local stories were rooted in paranoia and coincidence. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a sense of overconfidence, he pushed through the creaking gate just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The cemetery was a sprawling, chaotic mess. Tombstones leaned at odd angles, some half sunken into the ground. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. His footsteps crunched loudly on the gravel path, the sound amplified in the eerie silence. As David ventured deeper, he noticed something strange. The gravestones bore no dates past 1903, as if time had stopped in this place. The inscriptions were faded, and many of the stones were cracked or broken. He laughed to himself. "Just an old, neglected cemetery," he muttered. But then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping. He paused, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. The sound was distant, like something heavy striking the ground, and it was coming closer. His bravado wavered, but he pressed on, telling himself it was the wind or an animal. The thumping grew louder, joined by a dragging noise, as though something was being pulled across the ground. David stopped walking, his breath caught in his chest. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing unnaturally. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, so profound it made his ears ring. Then a whisper, soft and barely audible, tickled the edge of his hearing. "Why are you here?" David swung his flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the fog that had begun to gather. There was nothing there, just rows of crooked headstones and gnarled trees. "Who's there?" he demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. The whispering returned, louder this time, overlapping voices speaking in tones of sorrow and anger. The words were indistinguishable, but they clawed at his sanity. His flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. Panic set in as David fumbled with the device, his hands shaking. The dragging sound started again, impossibly close now. He turned, and in the dim light of the moon, he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the path, its form obscured by the fog. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and it carried a shovel that glinted in the pale light. The figure tilted its head, and David could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. "Leave," it whispered, though its lips didn't move. David didn't need another warning. He turned and ran, the cemetery twisting and changing around him. The path he'd taken was gone, replaced by rows of graves that seemed to close in on him. His breathing was ragged, his legs aching as he stumbled through the dark. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more urgent. He tripped over a root and fell, landing hard on the damp earth. As he scrambled to his feet, he realized he was standing in front of a freshly dug grave. The figure was there, at the edge of the grave, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Slowly, it raised its shovel and plunged it into the earth, the sound of metal against soil echoing in the stillness. David tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He backed away, only to feel hands, cold, skeletal hands, grasping at his ankles, pulling him toward the open grave. "No! Let me go!" he cried, kicking and thrashing. The whispers turned to laughter, cruel and mocking, as the hands dragged him closer. The last thing he saw was the figure standing over him, its shovel poised to strike. When the townspeople found his camera the next morning, it was sitting on the steps of the cemetery gate. The footage showed David's terrified face, illuminated by the flashlight, as he whispered, "There's something here." The final frame was of the open grave, the dirt piled neatly beside it, as though waiting for its next visitor. The town of Greystone had one rule. No one was to enter Hollowvale Cemetery after midnight. It wasn't just a superstition. It was a warning passed down for generations, carved into the very fabric of their lives. But for Sophia, a skeptic and new to the town, the rule sounded like an invitation. The cemetery sat on a hill, its iron gates twisted and blackened as though scorched by fire. The gravestones were ancient, their inscriptions worn away, and a thick canopy of trees overhead blocked out the moonlight. Sophia arrived just as her watch struck 12. Armed with a lantern and her phone, she stepped through the gates, which groaned like a dying creature. The air inside was thick, heavier than it had been outside, and every breath she took seemed to echo. "Just an old cemetery," she muttered, trying to steady her nerves. Nothing to be afraid of. The night was silent, oppressively so, and yet she swore she could hear faint whispers, like distant voices carried on the wind. They were indistinct, just out of reach, but the cadence sent chills down her spine. As she wandered deeper, the ground beneath her seemed to shift. The mossy earth felt damp, squelching underfoot. Her lantern flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to move. That's when she noticed the mausoleum. It was larger than the others, its stone surface cracked and weathered, yet its heavy iron door stood slightly ajar. Her curiosity overpowered her hesitation, and she approached, her lantern casting a warm glow over the cold stone. The whispers grew louder as she neared, though they remained indecipherable. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open, the hinges letting out a wail that echoed into the depths of the tomb. Inside, the air was colder, and a spiral staircase descended into darkness. Against her better judgment, Sophia followed it, each step feeling more like a descent into another world. At the bottom, she found a circular chamber lined with alcoves. Within each alcove was a coffin, their lids carved with intricate symbols she couldn't decipher. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it a single book bound in cracked leather. The whispers were deafening now, pressing against her skull. They seemed to emanate from the book itself. Despite the rising dread in her chest, she reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating, and for a moment Sophia felt a flicker of relief. Then the coffins began to move. The lids slid open with agonizing slowness, the sound of stone against stone filling the chamber. Sophia backed away, her lantern shaking in her grasp. From the coffins came figures cloaked in shadow, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkness around them. Their faces were hollow voids, and their movements were jerky, as though they were unused to their own limbs. "You should not be here," one rasped, its voice scraping against her mind like nails on glass. Sophia turned and bolted up the stairs, her lantern's flame sputtering as she ascended. The whispers returned, now louder, more frantic, and the shadows followed her, slithering along the walls like living things. She burst out of the mausoleum and ran through the cemetery, her breath hitching as the ground beneath her seemed to grab at her feet. The gates loomed ahead, but the shadows moved faster, stretching toward her like hungry tendrils. She reached the gates just as the first tendril wrapped around her ankle, icy and unyielding. Sophia screamed, pulling herself free and collapsing onto the dirt road outside. The shadows stopped at the threshold of the gate, recoiling as if burned. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of her ragged breathing. She looked back at the cemetery, her lantern's dying light illuminating the figures standing just beyond the gate. They watched her, their hollow faces unreadable, but she could feel their hatred, their hunger. Sophia staggered to her feet and ran, vowing never to return. But the cemetery wasn't done with her. That night, as she lay in her bed, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around her like a shroud. And when she turned on her light, she saw them, the shadowed figures standing at the foot of her bed, their hollow faces staring, waiting. Sophia screamed, but no one heard her. The old chapel at Willowmore Cemetery was a place of fear, shrouded in legends whispered by the locals. They called it the Bellkeeper's Curse. The bell in its tower had been silent for over a century, ever since the night it tolled endlessly without wind, marking the unexplained disappearance of the bellkeeper himself. It was said that anyone who entered the chapel after dark would hear the bell ring once, for them. Aaron didn't believe in curses. As a photographer chasing forgotten places, he saw the chapel as the perfect subject for his growing portfolio. He ignored the warnings of the cafe owner that morning, dismissed the anxious looks of townsfolk who overheard his plans. "Just don't stay past sundown," the owner had pleaded. He smirked as he parked his car outside the cemetery gate that evening. Sundown was the best time for eerie atmospheric shots. The cemetery was a sprawling labyrinth of tilted gravestones and skeletal trees clawing at the sky. The chapel rose in the distance, its steeple jagged against the twilight. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to thicken, damp and clinging like cobwebs. The chapel door groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and decay. Rows of crumbling pews faced an altar draped in tattered cloth, and the high bell tower loomed above. Aaron began taking pictures, the flash of his camera illuminating the darkness. The images were perfect. The cracked stone walls, the shattered stained glass, the eerie emptiness of the space. Then he noticed something strange. In the corner of his shots, near the shadowed stairwell leading to the bell tower, a figure appeared. It was faint, almost translucent. A man in tattered clothes with hollow eyes staring directly into the lens. Aaron lowered his camera and turned toward the stairwell. It was empty. He laughed nervously, chalking it up to a trick of the light or dust on the lens. But the feeling in the chapel changed. The silence became oppressive, the shadows deeper. His instinct told him to leave, but his pride wouldn't let him. He aimed his camera at the stairwell and took another picture. The bell rang. It was a single deafening toll that shook the chapel, reverberating through Aaron's chest. He stumbled back, staring up at the tower in disbelief. There was no wind, no reason for the bell to sound. The second toll followed, louder and closer, and this time he swore he felt the floor vibrate beneath him. The shadows at the stairwell shifted, and the translucent figure emerged, solidifying with every step. The bell tolled again. The figure was clearer now, its features grotesque. It had the body of a man, but its eyes were empty sockets oozing darkness. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and it reached for Aaron with hands twisted and claw-like. Aaron bolted for the door, the bell tolling with each step he took, as though marking his impending doom. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to reach for him, pulling at his clothes and dragging him back. He burst out of the chapel and into the night, stumbling over gravestones as the sound of the bell chased him. He didn't stop until he reached his car, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit the key into the ignition. As he sped away, the chapel receded into the distance, but the bell rang once more, a final ominous note. Aaron didn't sleep that night. He couldn't shake the image of the figure or the sound of the tolling bell. In the early hours of the morning, he checked his camera, hoping to find an explanation in his photos. The pictures were all wrong. Every frame taken inside the chapel showed the same thing. The figure standing inches behind him, its hollow eyes locked on the back of his head. And in the final shot, taken as he fled, the bell tower was alight with shadowy figures, all watching him leave. The last sound he heard before the camera shut off was the bell ringing once, long and low, for him. There was a legend about Black Hollow Cemetery, whispered by travelers who dared to pass near it. They called it the Watcher's Ground, a place where the dead didn't rest and the living didn't leave. The story went that anyone who stayed there after the clock struck midnight would encounter the Watcher, an entity bound to the land, forever guarding something or someone hidden deep within the earth. Lucy had heard the story from her grandmother as a child, but she'd always dismissed it as folklore. Now, years later, and armed with the skepticism of adulthood, she decided to face her childhood fear. A friend had dared her to spend the night in Black Hollow, and she saw it as an opportunity to prove herself. The cemetery was tucked away in the woods, far from the nearest road. Lucy arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The iron gates were rusted shut, but she squeezed through a gap, her heart racing as she stepped onto the hallowed ground. Rows of gravestones stretched into the darkness, many of them cracked or weathered beyond recognition. The air was eerily still, as if the entire cemetery was holding its breath. She set up her small camping chair and settled in with her phone and a thermos of coffee, determined to pass the hours uneventfully. At first, it was quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling leaves in the wind. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. Even the insects stopped chirping. Then she saw it, a light. It flickered in the distance, near the center of the cemetery. It wasn't a warm, welcoming light, but cold and unnatural, like the glow of a distant flame. She squinted, trying to make sense of it. The light moved. Lucy felt a chill run down her spine as it began to drift closer, weaving between the gravestones like a ghostly lantern. She gripped her flashlight tightly, its beam trembling as she turned it toward the light. Nothing. When her flashlight illuminated the space where the light should have been, there was only empty air. Yet, when she lowered it, the glow returned, closer now. A sound broke the silence, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Her breath hitched as she scanned the darkness, but she saw no one. The footsteps came again, deliberate and heavy, moving toward her. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the cemetery was silent again. Then she heard a whisper, soft and guttural, coming from the direction of the light. "Leave." Lucy scrambled to her feet, her flashlight beam darting wildly as she searched for the source of the voice. The light was gone now, replaced by a shadowy figure standing in its place. It was tall, its body draped in something tattered and flowing, its face obscured beneath a hood. The Watcher. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at her. Its shadow seemed to stretch across the ground, reaching her feet despite the distance. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing in her ears. "You shouldn't have come." Lucy backed away, her legs trembling. She tried to run, but the ground beneath her seemed to shift and soften, dragging at her feet like quicksand. The figure moved closer, though its body never seemed to walk. It glided as if carried by the wind. In her panic, Lucy tripped over a gravestone and fell hard, her flashlight skittering away. She scrambled to grab it, but when she turned it back on, the beam revealed something horrifying. The gravestones around her were shifting, rising from the earth as skeletal hands clawed their way free. The ground opened like a yawning mouth, and the Watcher loomed above it, its hood falling back to reveal a face devoid of features, just smooth, pale skin and hollow indentations where eyes should have been. "Stay," it hissed, the word piercing her mind like a dagger. Lucy screamed and scrambled to her feet, running blindly toward the gates. The ground writhed beneath her, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices begging, pleading, warning. She reached the gate and threw herself through the gap, landing hard on the dirt road outside. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by the hum of the forest night. When she dared to look back, the cemetery was silent and still. The gravestones were as they had been, the ground undisturbed. But as she caught her breath, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and froze. The screen was lit with a single notification: photo saved. With trembling hands, she opened the photo gallery. The image was of her sitting in her camping chair, staring directly at the camera. And behind her, looming in the shadows, was the Watcher. They called it the Whispering Field, a sprawling, overgrown cemetery hidden on the outskirts of Blackthorn Hollow. Locals avoided it, claiming that anyone who ventured there after sundown would hear whispers, soft, sinister murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And those who listened for too long, they never came back. Elliot, a thrill-seeker with a penchant for debunking urban legends, decided to visit the Whispering Field alone. Armed with a flashlight and a digital recorder, he wanted proof that the stories were nothing more than superstition. He arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gray. The gate was barely hanging onto its hinges, its iron bars twisted and streaked with rust. Elliot pushed it open, the screech echoing into the silence. The cemetery was vast, with rows of headstones jutting out of the ground like crooked teeth. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of moss and decay. Elliot set his recorder on a nearby gravestone and pressed record. "All right," he said aloud, his voice oddly loud against the quiet. "I'm here in the Whispering Field. Let's see what all the fuss is about." For the first hour, there was nothing. He wandered between the graves, reading faded inscriptions and taking notes on his phone. The stillness was unsettling, but he reminded himself that it was just an old cemetery. But then the whispers began. At first they were faint, so soft he thought they might be the wind. But as he moved deeper into the cemetery, they grew louder, clearer. Elliot froze, straining to listen. The whispers weren't random. They were words, though not in any language he recognized. The voices overlapped, high and low, male and female, young and old. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost deafening. Then, just as he began to relax, a single voice spoke, low and guttural. "Leave." Elliot spun around, shining his flashlight wildly. There was no one there, just rows of gravestones disappearing into the darkness. His pulse quickened, but he forced a laugh. "Nice try," he muttered, trying to sound braver than he felt. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding him. They seemed to come from the ground, the trees, the air itself. "Get out," one voice hissed. "Stay," another pleaded, trembling with desperation. The beam of his flashlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Elliot backed away, but the ground beneath him shifted, softening as if he were standing on something alive. Then he heard it, a sound like wet earth being disturbed. He shone his flashlight at his feet and froze in terror. Hands, skeletal, decayed, and covered in dirt, were clawing their way out of the ground. They grasped at his ankles, their grip icy and unrelenting. Elliot screamed, stumbling back as more hands emerged from the earth. The whispers became a roar, the voices crying out in anger and sorrow. He bolted, his recorder forgotten as he sprinted toward the gate. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, tripping him up and pulling at his feet. The shadows chased him, coiling and writhing like living things. When he finally reached the gate, he threw himself through it and landed hard on the gravel path outside. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by an eerie stillness. Elliot lay there, panting and trembling, too terrified to look back. When he finally did, the cemetery was as it had been, silent and undisturbed. But something was wrong. His flashlight flickered back to life, casting its beam onto his hands. They were covered in dirt, and beneath his fingernails were scraps of decayed flesh, as if he'd been digging. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out with shaking hands to find a notification. New recording saved. He stared at the screen for a moment before playing the audio. It began with his own voice, calm and confident. Then came the whispers, growing louder and more frantic. But the recording didn't end when he ran. It continued, capturing the sound of digging, of muffled screams, of something heavy being dragged across the earth. And the last voice on the tape wasn't his own. "Welcome back," it said, low and cold, followed by the sound of the cemetery gate slamming shut.